Okay, so before I start, I'm going to be talking about veganism, and this is a word which may mean different things to different people. So just so we are all on the same page, I'm going to be talking about ethical veganism, and its core belief, which is anti-speciesism. This is the belief that we shall not treat some species as being lesser than others or above others, and it uses a lot of the same arguments as anti-racists. Now, this video may be seen as a critique of veganism. However, I want to make it clear that this is not the intent of this video. This is simply an interesting idea I had, or I'd like to think it's interesting, within the framework of veganism. As discussed in my previous video, which I highly encourage you to watch, if I make a copy of my mind running on a computer, well, this copy should be treated in a similar manner to the real me, and it should have a lot of the same rights as the real me. This would obviously mean that if I simulate a pig's mind, it should be treated in a similar manner to a real pig with the same rights. And this logic should hold true for any animal or, in principle, anything. But we can continue this logic all the way down to relatively small creatures such as snails, with only some 10,000 neurons or so, or C. elegans, a roundworm with only 302 neurons. That is small enough to be potentially simulated with current technology. I think we could also be in agreement that if we took the simulation of C. elegans and in the simulation we removed one of these neurons, well, it should still be treated in a somewhat similar way to a real C. elegans, even though it's not a direct clone but a semi-synthetically created organism. But what if we did not simulate neurons, but instead created our own completely synthetic neurons or something similar? Well, if these makes the same calculations or somewhat similar calculations to real neurons, creatures made from these, well, they should also be treated in a somewhat similar way to real creatures, with the same number of neurons or intellect. Now, this all sounds somewhat futuristic. However, simple synthetic neurons are used on an everyday basis in neural networks on Google, Amazon, Netflix, and Siri, to name a few. Should these pieces of software then also have some rights applied to them? Now, the simple argument against this is that veganism and vegetarianism, for that matter, is made for the minimization of suffering of animals, and these programs or robots don't feel suffering or pain, and these rights therefore do not apply to them. This is definitely true, they don't feel pain like we do. But let's go back to creatures like C. elegans with so few neurons. Well, it will most likely act in a quite robotic way. For example, creatures with so few neurons, well, they don't have the intellectual capability to recognize objects as objects. But when they need to find food, they just measure how much green they see, and if it goes over some threshold, well, it's food. This is a level of intellect I can write in a few lines of code, and these creatures may very well feel pain in a similar way to this. So understanding pain and suffering in the complex and intricate way we feel it is somewhat narrow and doesn't apply to all living beings. So for veganism to encompass all creatures, we need to broaden our scope of what pain is. These types of pain, which lies quite far from our own perception of pain, I'm just going to call pain analogs. So the question now becomes, does neural nets have a pain analog? Well, not necessarily. But there is one type of neural net or machine learning which does have one, and that is reinforcement learning. And this is because this type of neural net or machine learning algorithm works by giving it a gamified version of a problem, and when it does something wrong, it's punished, like a game character losing health. And it's just gonna keep trying to minimize this punishment as much as possible. And I'd say that this punishment is a pain analog of sorts, and quite possibly somewhat similar to what creatures like C. elegans feels. And this is what I want to ask how you should deal with within the framework of veganism. Does dumb robots, like the ones we have today in search engines and so on, do they have the same rights as dumb living beings? Even though they don't feel pain and suffering quite like we humans do. When we see creatures as robotic, or robots as robotic for that matter, it is not a universal truth. It's because we can see to some extent how they work, the inner workings of their brain. And a hypothetical creature like those created from a technological singularity, well, they may think of humans as being robotic, as they are significantly advanced to see how we act. So, whether something is robotic or not, that sort of depends on the difference in intellect, rather than some objective level of intellect. So lastly, I'm just going to say that I don't know how to deal with this within the framework of veganism. So, thanks for watching. I'd really like to hear your arguments and counter-arguments. However, the YouTube comment section isn't really made for discussion, so I've created a subreddit if you'd like to discuss the video, make some suggestions for future videos, or have an interesting idea you'd just like to share. So yeah, I'm still a pretty new channel, so it would mean a lot if you'd subscribe and or participate in the discussion.